Okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. It is Wednesday, the 1st of April. We're live again. Thank you, everybody, for joining me as always. It's great to have everybody logged in. And today we are day 3, basically, of talking about agents. And yeah, so just very briefly, for the rest of the week, tomorrow we're going to be talking about third-party investment, which is a pretty topical issue. Friday we're going to be talking about social media, and next Monday we're going to talk about the pretty controversial and current topic of financial fair play as well. So we're going to, I'm just looking at Marco's comments. Have you changed your outfit? I'm keeping quite consistent with my cap and my glasses and a dark shirt, a t-shirt, but I've tried to stay quite consistent throughout. But yeah, I think you'll be pleased to know I do change my clothes. So what I wanted to do very briefly was give you, as usual, an outline on what we're going to discuss today. Usually it's threefold, as always. So the things that I wanted to touch on was more or less just do a quick recap of first day and second day, which was first day, just, provide a bit more of a nuanced, balanced view on agents. The second thing was talking about representation contracts and the important things that tend to be in those deals. And then what I want to talk about today, which is, pretty much, but in my experience of working on a lot of these deals, it's important just to set it out in a little bit of detail about how agents are actually usually a really important element for the side that they don't get caught out. So what I'm going to do as usual, or say as usual, side that they don't get caught out. So what I'm going to do as usual, or say as usual for the second day running, is what I wanted to do is do a usual quiz question. So we did the quiz question yesterday, which was how much in the period from February 18 to January 19 did Liverpool pay in agents' fees? The question for tonight is how much from February 18 to the end of January 19 did all 20 Premier League clubs spend during that period? So I'll just repeat the question again. From February 18 until the end of January 19, in total, what was the total Premier League club spend on agents' fees? So start having a bit of a think about that. Put your answers into the live chat. The person that comes up with the closest amount quickest is the winner. And you will get a copy of the book that then I can send over to you whenever you send through an email. So let's talk about briefly, by way of recap, what we talked about on day 1 of the agents, on the agents element was that actually usually agents are incredibly well networked, having to be extremely good negotiators, having to problem solve, find solutions, do tons of the dirty work, tons of the heavy lifting, and usually it's actually pretty difficult to get a deal over the line. And yesterday, what we actually talked about, again, if you remember, was the material parts of a representation contract. And the material parts of a player agent rep contract can be the details, exclusivity, length, commission rate, scope of the representation contract. Does it include on-field and off-field, dispute resolution? Does it work for particular territories? Is there subcontracting, etc.? So that's part of the summary of what we talked about previously. It's pretty hard being an agent, and it's important to be clued up on the rules, but also on what needs to be put into a representation contract. And today, what I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so before the questions is more or less trying to explain who actually pays agents. So I'm going to go slow on a couple of parts because it's important just to let a little bit sink in. I'm going to try and give a few figures and a few examples, and then we can do some questions as well as we continue on. So it might sound simple enough to suggest that an agent gets around 5 to 10% of a player's basic wage by way of commission. But usually the difficult part to explain is who actually pays the agent. Now, the usual practice, at least in the US, but which isn't normal practice in the UK, is that in the US, the player, the talent, pays his agent for the services and the commission that for the work that they've basically been undertaking for. But that's a very different situation to the UK and a lot of mainland Europe as well. And that's because the vast majority of Premier League and top-end football league transfers, at least in my experience anyway, involve the buying club paying the player's agent. So the club is paying the player's agent. The details can vary, and there are a few different out in a bit of detail below. And it does involve a little bit of tax, but not really too much. But hopefully you can understand the specifics. So the basic example, which usually doesn't occur, is that the player pays. So in my experience, I haven't seen too many instances where a player will pay his agent, his or her agent, for the work that they have undertaken for a transfer or a contract renegotiation. So in very limited circumstances when dealing with Premier League transfers, a player may pay his agent for finalising the transfer. And that's because the basic position is under a player's representation contract with his agent, as we talked about yesterday. The player may be obliged to pay, for example, 5% of what will usually be his gross basic wage, but that doesn't happen too often. But if I give you an example, let's just say a player is paid £2 million per year. The agent will receive £100,000 per year. Let's say that's 5%. And that will come from the player per year in one annual payment. So that's the very basic position. If a player pays his agent, which almost always doesn't happen in my experience, that would be how it would work. Now, the second approach, which is almost always a nuanced version of the third approach, which we'll talk about in a second, but let's just do it by graduations for the moment, is the second approach, which is the club pays as part of the transfer arrangement. So club pays. So in practice, even if the player is required to pay his agent as set out in their rep contract, so let's say the rep contract says, player, you will pay 5% commission to the agent, the player's agent can negotiate that the club pays the agent on the player's behalf. So I'll just say that again. The player's agent can negotiate that the club pays the agent on the player's behalf, i.e. instead of the player. This benefit means the player doesn't need to pay his agent. However, paying an amount on a player's behalf in the UK is classed as a benefit in kind payment by the tax authorities, and the player will pay tax on the payment by the club to the agent. So if I give you an example, a player's paid 2 million, so we do the same one. A player's paid £2 million a year. The agent receives 100,000, which is 5% from the club, but the club are paying it on the player's behalf as a benefit to the player. Now, what will happen there is, although the player isn't paying anything to his agent, because that's a taxable benefit, the player will have a tax charge to pay, which is usually just under 50%, 47% as an income tax level of that amount. So even though the player isn't paying his agent, the player will still have to pay £47,000 to the tax authorities for each year that his agent, his or her agent, receives that commission. So that's the second example where, in a straightforward way, the club will pay all of the commission by way of a benefit in kind for acting for the player. What tends to happen in practice is that the club pays because the agent is acting for the buying club as well. So I'll try and go slow again. Sometimes the buying club will pay the player's agent to act on its behalf during a transfer too. And you may well think that that is a conflict of interest, and you'd be right. And in such a scenario, the player has to agree that his agent can work for both sides. And I'll try and explain the reason, one of the tax reasons why this can sometimes be the case. So let's just say again, the player's paid £2 million a year. The agent will be paid for the work he or she does for the club and the work that he or she does for the player. So the agent will then receive £50,000, so 2.5%, from the club for work done on their behalf, on the club's behalf, i.e. £50,000 for club services, and then the other 2.5%, the other £50,000 from the club on behalf of the player, i.e. for player services. And without getting too complicated, and there can be some variations of that, most of the deals that I see are variations of that. Now, the reason why it's important then just to separate those two examples is, in example 2, the second example, the player is required to pay tax on the £100,000 paid by the club on his behalf, which I sort of set out before. In the latest example, the player will be paying tax only on the £50,000 of the portion for work that was being undertaken on his behalf. Therefore, that reduces the player's tax bill. So instead of paying 47% of 100,000, he is paying 47% of 50,000. Now, to justify the £50,000 fee that the player's agent is undertaking club services, the agent will have to demonstrate that they did work on behalf of the club. And that's usually set out in a separate representation contract between the player, the club, and the agent. So usually in that instance, there will be the underlying rep contract between the player and his agent or her agent. And then there will also be, because if the club is going to pay the player's agent for club services, there will then be what's called a tripartite agreement between the player, the club, and the agent. So, and to give it a little bit more context as well, we talked over the last few days as well about the FIFA reforms to all of this. And at present, FIFA at least has said, even though it looks like an agent can't work sell side, i.e. selling club side, buying club side, and for the player at the same time, it looks like it will still be permitted to be able to act for the player and the buying club at the same time, because they specifically said in their initial proposals that if the agent was going to do that, act for the player and the buy side, they could do and take 3% from player and 3% from buying club. So that's more or less the situation as to the complicated nature of how commission is paid to agents in football in the UK. Now, there can be variations of that across the continent and across continents, but in my experience, that's what tends to happen. Now, there have been instances in the past as well where HMRC, the tax authorities, have looked into particular practices, because you can just imagine, in the same way as we talked about image rights deals, and that being too far weighted in terms of as a proportion of the total pay that a player was receiving, a disproportionate amount was going through his image rights company, let's say 70%, and then only 30% was going through his employment PAYE contract. In the same way, in terms of agents' fees, what HMRC has been quite specific on over the years is effectively trying to ensure that the services that are being provided are actually being provided. So, for example, in the past, there were instances potentially that I read about and was reported where, if let's just say we take those examples where the commission is £100,000, if, for example, the club say, well, we'll pay £90,000 for club services to the agent and then £10,000 for player services to the agent, then the player is only being taxed as 47% on the 10%. But if, for example, there is no club services and it's all being paid by the club for player services, then he's being taxed 47% on 100,000, which is obviously quite a big difference. So the tax authorities have been quite specific about, in particular instances, saying, well, hold on a bit, explain to me, agent, why the percentage splits are such that it's 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30. Usually anything more than a 50-50 split may bring up issues for the tax authorities. But obviously it's pretty vital that if the player's agent is working for the club, that they are undertaking club services and that they are effectively able to show that and demonstrate that they have undertaken those services. So 50 minutes just about up. Let's go and see if we can get those answers to the quiz question. Let's see what we came up with. So if you remember, the question was between February 18 and the end of January 19, the total 20 Premier League clubs spend on agents was. So let's just have a look to see people's amounts. So we've got 189, 670, 467, 58 million, 500 million, 260 million, 260. Oliver Finlay said a lot. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so you would be pleased to know that Marco got the right figure. So it was £260 million just before Francesco. So apologies, Francesco. Marco, I've got a feeling you might already have the book though, pal. But yes, and that's where you might got the answer from. But well done. And if you need another copy, then more than happy to oblige. So, yep. The answer was £260 million spent on agents' fees. Okay, let's go and do some questions. So let's start them off. So Stephen, thanks Steve. Who pays when a veteran re-signs an extension with a current club, i.e. Kane with Spurs? Well, I'm not sure he's a veteran just yet, but he's certainly a club stalwart, that's for sure, been there for a while. For any renegotiation of a employment contract, that would be classed as a transaction, and therefore Kane's agent would be entitled to commission, and that commission would almost always be paid by Spurs, and Spurs would tend to split that commission across player services and club services. So that's the basic position there. The question that can sometimes come along, which is an interesting point as well, is usually agents are paid in installments too. Usually, sometimes you can get a lot up front, but otherwise not. If the agent is paid in installments, and then let's just say 2 years later, a renegotiation of the contract happens, then there can be a question about whether the agent, if there are still outstanding installments due, whether the agent should still be receiving those outstanding installments plus any new installments, or once the negotiation of the contract happens and a new installment plan for potential commission is to be paid, whether those old installments fall away and don't become payable anymore. And that's one question that does crop up sometimes. I know that's certainly something Dr. Urquhart has talked about a lot. Urquhart, I believe you're going ahead with your session tomorrow at 4, and maybe that might be a good question to chat about as well. I'd be keen to hear more about that too. Joseph, watching you whilst cooking dinner. Thank you for doing that. I'm glad you're a better multitasker than me. It's cool. Arya, why does the player need to still pay tax when the club's paying the agent? So the reason why that's the case is it's almost similar to a company car or health insurance, is that because someone else is paying on your behalf, you, the player, is still receiving that benefit of not having to pay. So you still have to pay tax on someone else paying on your behalf, is the short answer. And that's why that can happen. But it does lead to a particular point I wanted to actually raise, which was what does happen on occasion, and sometimes quite a lot, is that foreign agents and foreign players coming into the UK don't actually realise that there is a tax charge to a benefit in kind payment. So it can sometimes be 2 or 3 years after the player has left the UK even, that HMRC is still sending letters asking for that money, because ultimately maybe the player and his agent hasn't taken tax advice, accountancy advice, to understand that they are required to pay that money, and that can actually leave really, really significant bills. And a lot of the time, lawyers and accountants and tax advisors have to pick up the pieces to try and work out payment plans with HMRC for the player to pay back, or rather pay the tax that is due on those benefit in kind payments. Question from Marco, I saw a second ago. Yep. What if the agent is not also working for the buying club, i.e. just for the player? Does the club still pay the 5%? Yeah, it's a great question. It can certainly be the case that the agent can just work for the, what if the agent is not working for buying club, just for player? Yeah, it can be that way as well. The club can still pay the 5%. And in that case, what will happen is, because there are no club services, the player will have to pay 47% or the equivalent percentage of tax rate on the benefit in kind commission. Question from Steve again. Suppose a player were to refuse to allow his agent to work for the club as well. What would the agent forego? What new work would another attorney do on behalf of the club in lieu of the agent? I'm not sure the second. What new work would another attorney do on behalf of the club? Oh, well, I think for the first bit, it is possible for the player to refuse to allow his agent to work for the club. It is a possibility that could happen. He can refuse to waive on the Football Association forms. But ultimately, it is in his interest to do that, because so long as it's legitimate and the agent is fulfilling particular club services, the agency fee and the tax that he will have to pay, the player will have to pay, will be reduced. And on the second question, sorry, Steve, what new work would another attorney do on behalf of the club in lieu of the agent? So I think you're saying that if no one was working for the buying club, what would the lawyer do? It wouldn't necessarily be that. A lot of the services that the agent would be providing to the buying club would be to make sure you're acting in good faith, bring the player to the table, act in best interests of all parties, etc. There can be those type of services, and there also can be ongoing services, which would be to make sure that the player isn't unsettled, that the player's acting in good faith, that any issues that are dealt with correctly between all the different parties, etc. So there are obligations and services being undertaken at the time of the transaction, and then obviously going forward as well. Marco, where can you find the agent player club contract, i.e. template? So I will just try and find a link to it just as I finish. So Marco, if you stay online, I can provide that link. But basically, if you search on Google for FA, so Football Association intermediaries, and then representation contract, there are 2 or 3 different representation contracts depending on particular scenarios, and they can be found there. Javier, in the American system, when you're an agent, the league pays the agent. Okay, yeah, really interesting. And yeah, I know that can sometimes be the case, and that can sometimes cause some tax issues there. Sino, can you recommend any readings or short course on image rights? There's a great book called Football and the Law. It's published by Bloomsbury, and it's edited by a great lawyer called Nick DeMarco. There's quite a large section there on image rights that I'd recommend. The other one, which is a bit heftier one, but because I was doing some research on it today, is Sport, Law and Practice. It's quite a detailed, practitioner-heavy book, but there is a very good section on image rights in there. The last thing I would also say is there's some great pieces on a fantastic website called lawinsport.com, and that's from one of my good friends, Sean Cottrell, who's the founder there. There's some great pieces on image rights in particular countries and how things work in practice. Javier, it's more a straight line concept, and in terms of delays of payments, it's likely to be minimal. Is there a way, a clause, so to avoid delays in Europe? Do you mean, I'm not sure, do you mean, if you mean delays in payment, I'm not sure. Usually there have to be particular dates that are set out for payment. And there's an interesting point going on at the moment, really, with obviously everything going on in the world right now and the financial implications of that. There's a query about whether agents, are going to get paid on time, whether transfer fee installments are going to get paid on time, etc. So, yeah, that's tricky. Crow, why is it 47%? I believe that's the amount, which is the higher income tax rate plus national insurance contribution. I believe that's what it is. Marco, Dana, have your book, please give it to Francesco. That's absolutely good. Francesco, if you can just email me afterwards or send me a message, I'll be more than happy to send a copy. Next, we've got, sorry, I've lost track. There's loads of questions coming out, which is great. Alex Gibson, could you go over the example of the 2.5% split again, please? Yeah, so I can mention it pretty briefly. It's in the book as well. The point is that sometimes usually what happens is, if you can imagine, I'm the agent for the player, and what tends to happen in deals is I will provide club services to the club, and I will provide player services to the player. And what happens then is that the £100,000, instead of it just being for player services, is for club services as well. So £50,000 gets allocated for club services and £50,000 for player services. And that effectively means that for the player related amount, the player only has to pay tax on that amount, but doesn't have to pay tax on the club amount, because those services are being implemented for the club. Oliver, the incentive for an agent is then for a player to move clubs regularly, and it seems from the outside to happen that some agents do look to unsettle their player towards the end of their contract. It depends. Sometimes that isn't the incentive, is the truth, and that's part of the reason why clubs will want to try and input installments, commission installments. So the commission isn't paid up front, it's maybe paid over 2 or 3 years. Because what tends to happen is that if a player moves, let's just say 1.5 years, 2 years into his contract, an agent might still have outstanding commission installments due. Now, unless those payments are guaranteed, queries sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, there is an incentive for the agent not necessarily to move the player, because he or she may still have a number of installments due based on the current contract. Now, the argument sometimes is, well, if you move the player, then they'll get new installments on the new contract, that's fine. But effectively, the agent then isn't being paid the full amount for the previous deal and for the work that he had done for that. So sometimes the incentive isn't necessarily to move the player. Depends ultimately how those installments are particularly structured. Aria, is that what happened with Neymar, Sanchez and Messi in Spain with the tax authorities in relation to my earlier question on tax? I don't know the answer to that. I think that was more to do with image rights rather than agents tax, but I'm not sure on that, I'm afraid. I'm just going to try and do a few other questions. Thanks for your great insight into the payment regulations for agents. Sam Smith, in practice, when does the agent receive their fee from, for example, the selling club? Does it come straight out of the transfer fee, or would the agent expect it before the transfer fee is paid? Great question again. Usually, it can sometimes be a lump sum fee within a certain amount of time after the transfer fee has been paid to the selling club. If the transfer fee is being paid in installments, sometimes it can then be a percentage of the transfer fee when received in those installments. So sometimes the agent acting for the selling club may receive 5% of the transfer fee first installment, and then may receive 5% of the transfer fee second installment if that's in a year, and then etc. etc. So that's how it tends to work. Urquhart, I believe the US way is right. Agents should be paid by the players. directly, and the players can agree with the agents the percentage of the payments. Yeah, and I think I can understand why that makes a lot of sense to most. I think the issue here is I actually think there needs to be a more fundamental rejig of the way that players are treated as talent and on their annual return, because at the moment, my understanding is, at least, is that players can't deduct commission that they would otherwise pay to their agent as a deductible expense out of their annual return. And that ultimately is the issue, is that if players could deduct that as an expense, I think the whole system would potentially change, and we wouldn't need to get into the situation potentially where clubs have to pay agents on players' behalf, and then the player is paying tax on the benefit in kind, rather than paying the full amount in commission, whatever that rate is, and then deducting it each year from their annual return, their annual tax return. And I think that's part of the issue there. A couple more questions. Mazar, there have been instances where agents want their payments in a country abroad. How does that club shield itself from those circumstances? Yeah, there can be lots of national legislation which more or less governs how payments can be made into particular jurisdictions now, and that can be quite a complicated thing. Usually clubs will try and push back on those amounts being paid to offshore entities for lots of different possible money laundering, criminal enterprise, or otherwise, or shielding or tax particular issues. So yeah, totally right there. David, players tend to feel bad about this tax, especially when agents do not inform them about it. Once you've mentioned that an agent can add a clause to his contract to deal with P11D tax. Yes. So yeah, agreed. I mean, the best position is agents tell the player, either pay me 100% of the commission or pay 47% of the tax, or whatever that amount might be, to the tax authorities. And if you're going to go with 100% or 47% or the equivalent, then usually the player's on the whole fine with it, as long as you can put it aside. The two ways that you can deal with it, and Dr. Urquhart can maybe explain that in some detail as well, is you can sometimes have what's called a gross-up clause if you're in a very strong negotiation position as the player, where you can ask for an additional bonus to pay the tax that's payable on the annual return to HMRC. The other alternative is to get the tax code right in the PAYE system with the club to make sure that actually the tax comes out at source. So the tax gets paid on a monthly prorated basis, so that the player doesn't have that tax to pay in a lump at the end of the season, or the end of the financial year, basically, but it gets paid on a monthly basis. And from my view, I actually think that is the much better way of doing it, where the default position for all clubs should be that through the PAYE system, that P11D tax payment to HMRC is catered for. We've got quite a few questions going on here. I'll try and do a few more because we're getting to over 30 minutes. Sam Smith, are there any common methods by which the tax liability can be mitigated for the player services, or is the player generally stuck with paying 47%? Yeah, I don't know too many others. That tends to be that. Dr. Urquhart, agents don't inform their players, i.e. the tax implications, because some simply don't know about it. Agreed, especially foreign agents bringing players to the Premier League. Some just don't spend money on lawyers. I completely agree. That's why it's very important to get a good lawyer and a good accountant and some good tax guys. Sino, will the agent receive outstanding instalment payments if player leaves before the end of the contract is up? It simply depends on the contract. Sometimes the agents won't receive that. So I always try and negotiate that all of the agent's fees, if they're done in installments, are guaranteed. And that if a player moves, whilst there are still installments to be paid, that all of those installments then get paid as a result of that transfer actually happening. Ben Gibson, Ben, hey pal, clubs don't do enough to help players with the tax and financial side of the deal. Yeah, I mean, it's different club to club, but I agree that I think better, as much communication as possible between the player, agent and club, and getting that stuff done would really help. Miles, in practice, do agents tend to work with the same lawyers, i.e. in respect of contractual matters, tax, etc.? Do you, for example, tend to work on transactions involving the same group of agents? Yeah, so I tend to have probably about 10 to 15 agencies that have a range of agents working for them, and then a range of players. And I'll try and get involved in everything from the transfers to the employment contracts to commercial matters to image rights to disputes to reputation management, etc. So yeah, that's that. And I think we are almost there. So yeah, Dr. Urquhart, a good agent who thinks first for his client would have lawyers and tax advisors always included in the signing of contracts to protect his client and himself as well. Unfortunately, not very common. And the point there is, on a lot of the tax-related stuff, if it's image rights related, they can be deductible expenses out of the image rights company as well, which then is an expense really out of the profit or any monies that need to be taken out of the image rights company and by way of annual return too. Okay, that's 36 minutes. It's been a great session, fantastic questions, really enjoyed today. I actually don't have a book to recommend today. I hadn't even thought about. There is actually one book that I've started reading. Give me 1 second. It's this book by a brilliant writer called Yuval Noah Harari. So he's written books called Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. This is awesome, and I'd really, really recommend it. It's totally mind-blowing. Sapiens is the book I read first from Yuval, and he is more or less a history of mankind. I read it slowly because it was fantastic. So yeah, when everyone's got a bit of time on their hands, this is possibly another one I'd really recommend. And again, as usual, I know I didn't mention it yesterday, so apologies. You can obviously follow me on all of the channels. And yeah, as always, please feel free just to follow, amplify, share the Noah's Ark message as well. Noah's Ark are the children's hospice up in northwest London, doing a fantastic job. They've got some funding shortfalls at the moment. Please feel free to do whatever you can, if it's by way of donation or spreading the word. Just very quickly, Idea Egypt, can I buy your book as a PDF online? Yes, so if you just go to Amazon, you can get it as a Kindle or ebook, and then you can also look at it and listen to it on Audible if you need as well. Thanks everybody for joining, and tomorrow we are third party investment. See you then.